Hello everyone. Today I would like to explain about concepts behind QuerySet APIs available in Django framework and also why do we need these APIs. I will also explain about why do we call QuerySet as a query set. So at the end of the video you will be able to understand the underlying concepts behind QuerySet APIs and also different interaction points between Django application and then the actual database, so that once you understand the interaction or when does the actual request happens between our application and then the actual database, we can write our code in a proper way so that there is as less request as possible between database and our application using QuerySet APIs. I have some diagrams that might help you to visualize the interaction points and probably help you to explore more yourself if you understand where can we optimize several things. So let's say start. So basically I will go through the basic architecture of the Django framework and then explain about the interaction point of the database and the ORM which is used in the Django framework. So I will show you a data access layer which is embedded in the Django framework basically. And then later on we will dive deeper into the QuerySet APIs. We will also go through the source code of the QuerySet APIs just to get a brief understanding and then try to use some of the APIs. And then I will show you how can we make sure that the actual database request happened between our application and then the actual database. So I won't be able to cover everything, all the APIs, QuerySet APIs in this video, but I will be covering some of them and then try to explain you the concept behind it. And then in couple of further other videos, I will go into the details of other APIs that belongs to QuerySet. So let's start with the architecture of Django framework. If we see this diagram, we can see there is a client browser. It can be mobile app as well. So if a request comes from a client and then goes to a Django server, basically middleware, routing layer, everything on the right hand side is basically so everything under the right hand side is basically a Django server. And when the request flows from client to the server, first of all it goes to the request middleware layer, and then in the middleware layer we can apply different things like auth check or session related things, CSRF token related things. So from middleware the request goes or is dispatched to routing layer, which actually has a kind of lookup table that knows which request should call which function in a view layer. So view layer is actually a kind of controller that has different methods like get, put, post, and several other things, but basically a class with a method or only a methods. So from routing layer, if there is a request, let's say get slash blocks, so routing layer understand this is get blocks request, so it will map with a get function inside, or it will call a function called get inside a view layer. And then now inside that function it can interact with, or it can call serializer or a model, and then model actually interacts with the actual database, then returns the data to the view layer, and then from view layer request can pass through the middleware where we can again manipulate the response if we want. For example, if we want to add some kind of cookie or some kind of header signature related things, we can do that in the response object in the middleware and then return that to the client again. So this is basically the basic request flow within the Django application. And for this video we will be focusing more on this data access layer that actually involves the actual database, SQL, no SQL, it can be any kind of database, and then the model, the actual object that somehow resembles with the tables in the database. We will get into the details into the next slide, but will be this is will be the main focus of this video. So let's go to the next slide. So in Django framework, basically you can see we have the whole Django application, and then there is a database, the actual database. That can be SQL or no SQL. Django actually comes with SQLite database by default, but we can use Postgres or MySQL, anything. So this is something which is independent of any kind of framework. So the database, let's take an example of Postgres. So this is kind of general architecture for any kind of framework that has some kind of database, the database that stores the actual information, and that actually understand standard query language like select asterisk from blocks, or this is actually called standard query language. And then database is actually able to understand that standard query language. And then there are frameworks like Django, or let's say any other framework like Ruby on Rails or Play framework or Spring Boot. So all these frameworks actually had some kind of layer that actually interacts with the database using standard query language. So in this diagram you can see this database thing can exist independently, and then we can use different kind of external tools like pgadmin for PostgreSQL, Workbench for MySQL. We can use actually these tools to interact with the database. This is like a GUI tool from where you can directly connect with the database, and then you can see all the content of the database. You can apply, insert, update, delete any kind of queries in the database directly, independent of, despite of any kind of framework. And then these tools actually use this standard query language to interact with the actual database. Similarly, the same concept applies in the framework. Like in Django framework, we have an ORM called Django ORM that actually has models and query sets that actually provides a way to interact with the database. So basically, models are basically objects in a Python world, and then query sets actually provides a way so that you can query among the models or among the objects. That's why the name, it is called query sets, because it allows us to query among the objects, and those objects are actually mapped with a table in a database. That's why the name query set is called query set, because of its feature, like it allows us to query among the objects. So you can basically think of this block, models and query set block, as a shopkeeper in a shop, where you can go there and then you can interact with them, with the shopkeeper, and then request for, or you can ask them for any kind of products you want to buy from that shop. Like from a smaller shop, I don't mean like a big departmental store, but from a smaller shop, you can go there, you can say please give me Red Bull or soft drink or hard drinks or chips, anything you want. And then the shopkeeper is responsible to look for the actual product, and the shopkeeper knows where those products are placed. Then they will fetch those things and then deliver it to you. Similarly, the same concept applies here as well. So query sets actually provides a way to query among the objects, and then whatever you want, query set will know what kind of table, where it is, from where to fetch it. So it actually uh, tries to find if there are relationship between multiple tables. It knows about those things, and then it will fetch those things and give it to your application. So that's the main idea behind having models and query sets. The ORM, about the ORM thing, ORM is basically object relational mapper. It's called object relational mapper because we have different objects. For example, blog model, user model, comment model, these are different types of objects. And we just map different types of relationships between those objects. That's why it's called ORM, object relational mapper. And those mappers are actually internally mapped with the database tables in the database. And ORM gives other benefits as well. For example, it decouples your application logic with the database implementation details. For example, now your application don't need to know about what syntax do we use to query in SQLite or Postgres SQL, because the syntax among different database might be a bit different. I don't say it's there will be huge difference, but there will be some kind of syntax difference. There will be differences between different databases, but our application uh, doesn't need to know about those things, because there is this ORM that handles those things. Our application will talk to the ORM, and then ORM is responsible to understand what kind of database is used, how to uh, like translate the actual SQL queries and make a query to the database. That's why it gives really lots of flexibility. If you don't want to, if you want to, let's say, change the database, so you can just swap Postgres with MySQL, and you just need to change the ORM, but you don't need to change anything in your code. There might be maybe just a bit of changes, but you can easily change database, and you don't need to change anything in your application. And then it's the responsibility of ORM to handle the interaction with the database. Similarly, with this ORM, we can um, also use this for caching different things and apply some kind of optimization logic. For example, if there are similar requests, we don't need to make a request from Django application to the database. So we can cache few things here. So that's another benefit. So regarding this optimization technique, we should like the thing that's expensive is the request between Django application and the database. So we should try to have as less request as possible between our Django application and the database, and because the request is expensive. And the actual like model and query set, these things actually translate our queries into the actual SQL language and then make the request to the database. So we need to understand what's the responsibility of the models and the query set in our application. So this only provides us a way to interact with the database. That's a thing that we need to remember. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is query set? Basically, as I explained earlier, a query set is a way that provides us to query among the set of objects. That's why the name is query set, because it allows us to query among the objects, and then those objects are internally mapped with database and database tables. And then internally, query set actually can be constructed, filtered, sliced, and passed among different functions or classes without actually hitting the database. And then we need to notice that the database query actually happens when query set is evaluated. So query set is evaluated. If we don't evaluate the query set, actual request doesn't happen between um, our application and then the database. What happened to my laptop? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so okay, back to this slide. So we need to, this is an important point, we need to evaluate query set uh, in order for it to make a request or make a database query between the database and our application. I will explain in detail during the demo session what does it mean. So actually there are different ways where we can evaluate our query set through iteration. If we, let's say, have a for loop where we want to access some of the properties, then it will make the actual database query, it will hit the database. But if we just say block.objects.all, it won't do anything if it is not used in a for loop, or if it is not used in length list. If we don't try to evaluate the result of the query set, then it will not make request in the database. I will try to prove that during the demo session. So these are different ways we can evaluate our query set. So let's go to the project. So I have created a simple project called Django QuerySet Apis. This is just, you can just use Django admin command to say start project and then some name, and then you can open the application in Visual Studio. I have done that already. Then I have created a simple app called blocks, and I have added that inside the main project settings. Then the blocks, let's close this, we don't need it. And inside blocks app, we have a model where we have a simple blog model that has property called title and content. Now let's try to use our Python cell, Python 3 manage cell. Python 3 manage cell. Let's go into the cell and let's try to import. For the time being, I think I will copy paste some of the things. For example, these two things, let me uncomment, copy, comment it back. So here you can see I have imported Django.admin import connection. Just this object is used to check the connection between, whenever there is a request between our application, or let's say model or query set your ORM, from our ORM to the database. Whenever there is connection or the query between these two blocks, the connection object is used to populate the actual queries. You will see in a minute what does that mean. So let's say if we right now, if we try to check CTI connection dot queries queries, you will see this returns an empty object, because right now we haven't made any request from our ORM to the database. And let's try to query something. Objects b1 objects dot filter, let's say id is equal to 1. So currently I have written this line of code, but you might think that it might have already it might have already made a request to the database. There might already have been a request to the database, but that's not true. If we try to check this connection dot queries, you see this is still empty. But if we try to evaluate the query set, so basically the result of this filter is a query set. And if we try to evaluate this with, let's say, a length function, if we try to measure the length of the result or the query set, it returns 1. And now if we check the connection, you can see there is one entry inside connection dot queries, which means there has been one request between our application and then the actual database. Similarly, if we evaluate, as I explained in the slides, we can use several functions that evaluates our query set. For example, list. Let's go to list, and actually let's create another query set qs2, and then blog model dot objects dot filter id equal to 2. So basically id2 doesn't exist, I mean doesn't have the content. So if we try to check, if we try to use list, so no, let's try to check the connection again, connection dot queries. You can see there is only one entry, which means the request between our application and Django is not yet done. But if we try to evaluate using list function, let's say list qs2. Yeah, it is empty because we don't have the blog with id 2, but it actually made a request to the database in order to know that. So here you can see there is one object as key is sql, and then the actual query. Then second one is here, that was made with id 2. So first one with id 1, second one is with id 2. So you can see that only declaring something in this way doesn't mean that it has already made a request to the database. So we need to be careful when are we evaluating those things. So if we go to the documentation of the QuerySet API, here we can see the same thing. So I have actually followed the documentation from Django project regarding these QuerySet APIs. And here we can see we need to be careful about doing something in this way. I mean, if we just want to know if something exists or not, then it makes sense to use something like dot exist rather than trying to use that in a iteration in a for loop, which means whenever there it will make a request to the database, and then if we use dot, if we just want to make sure if something exists or not, then we can just use dot exists. So this is somehow a way we need to know when should we use what. So this was like a basic thing that we should understand when does the actual evaluation happen. Yeah, in this case the actual database request will happen whenever e.headline is used, because we are evaluating it, we are trying to access some property of a model, and then at that moment it will make the request. And so there are basically different types of query set APIs. For example, method that returns new query sets, for example, filter, exclude, order by, etc. And there are methods that do not return query set. And it is important to understand which method do return query set, because we can chain those functions. For example, if we know if filter returns a query set, we can do filter blah 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 id by 2, and then we can again apply another filter. Or we can change the method, and then we can again exclu, we can use exclude function after that. So basically it is useful to, if we know which method will return query set and which method will not return the query set. For example, if we have if we are using get method, then it will not return query set. It means we won't be able to chain it, and then we won't be able to use different APIs available in the query set object. Basically there is specific, and also basically there are other things as well that returns query set, for example and or operator. I won't go through this in this video, probably it will be covered in other videos. Similarly, there are aggregation functions, query queue objects that can be used to make queries. And if we try to follow the documentation, all the list of available functions are available here, like query set API, method that returns query set, filter, exclude, annotate. I will get into the details of these APIs in future videos, but you can see at least the list of everything that's available here, like and or what different options are available in the query set API. Now if we try to check the source code of the query set, like the actual implementation details of the query set, we can go to this Django db models query.py page, and here we can see class query set. So if we can see the actual implementation detail, we don't need to check all the details. It's just like how can we, if things are not available in the documentation of we, or if we want to find out what different methods are available or things that are public, then we can directly go to the documentation and check those things directly. And here you can see it says it represents a lazy database lookup for a set of objects. So as I explained earlier in the console, whenever we are declaring this object, this query like objects dot filter, it doesn't actually make a request to the database, but it makes a request whenever we start evaluating the query set. If we say query set 1 0 and then dot title or dot content, at that moment it will hit the database. So database lazy lookup means it only, like lazy people, they do the things only when it is required to do so. In the similar way, um, it does the request to the actual database only when it is required to do so. At this moment it is not necessary to just make a request to the database, but when we want to use the content of the database, for example, use the title to display on the front end, then at that moment it actually makes the request to the database. That's why it's called lazy lookup. And here you can see different properties that's available by the query set object, like query, and then there are the magic Python methods. We don't need to go into the details, but at least we can see there are functions like count, get, bulk create. We can create bulk of data in using one query. Similarly, we have bulk update. We can update bulk of objects with one function or with one query. Similarly, get or object, get or create, update or create. We can see all these public methods directly from the source code. Delete, update, create, everything is there. And we can also launch several things from the source code, like you can see in Python. I mean, it's best practice to use underscore for the private attributes, private methods. And then there are, yeah, different things, values list. These are API actually available in the documentation as well, so it gives quite a lot of information. And then here we can also see things like yield. So this is like a generator function. It's not directly relevant for now, but I just want to show that the generator in general, we don't try to use generator function or iterators anything in our code, but internally it is being used to write a proper optimized code. For example, in case of queries, we can say yield is used, that returns, that actually is good for memory optimizations. I won't be covering these things in this video, but I just want to show that there are things which are there are like generators which are implemented inside query set APIs while fetching the content from the database. Similarly, there are different ways like prefetch, selected, or select related, different functions that are optimized when we have a relationship between multiple tables. um, but it will be covered in the next video. So basically, I think that's what I wanted to show you. I know this is not a lot about I just showed you some example about this filter API. That's not enough, but I just wanted to show how the background behind query set and the concept behind the query set, and where are the points where we should try to optimize things. And then with this, I guess we should also be able to explore more ourselves, but I will be go into the details of how to use these APIs, in which context do we need to use these APIs in the future videos. But for now, I think um, that's all for this video, and I hope this was useful. And if you like this, please like and subscribe to my channel, of course, if you want. and let me know if you have any questions related to this. Thank you.